The first thing they told me was not to look into the mirrors. I didn't ask why. Orders were orders. And in the Soviet army, you followed them without question. But as our truck rumbled past the lifeless outskirts of Pripyat, I found myself staring at my own reflection in the cracked side mirror. I didn't recognize the man looking back at me. My name is Joao Mikhailov, a soldier of the Soviet Armed Forces. They sent me here to guard something, though no one would tell me what. Chernobyl was no longer just a disaster site. It was a wound in the world, one that refused to heal. The air felt thick, unnatural. Even the trees stood frozen, their branches twisted like grasping fingers. The sky was gray, but not with clouds. It was the kind of dull, suffocating gray that made you feel like you were being watched. The checkpoint was manned by grim-faced officers in heavy radiation suits. They waved us through with mechanical efficiency, barely acknowledging our presence. Behind them, the skeletal remains of buildings loomed over the road, their windows shattered, their interiors gutted by time and something else. Something unseen. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat as we neared the main compound. The silence was wrong. There should have been birds, the rustling of wind through leaves, something. But there was only the sound of our own breathing and the distant, rhythmic hum of a Geiger counter. When we stopped, an officer in a long, gray coat approached us. His face was lean, weathered, his eyes dull but observant. He carried a clipboard, and without looking up, he began reading. "You will follow all rules exactly as they are given to you," he said, his voice void of emotion. "Failure to comply will not be tolerated." He handed me a small, folded piece of paper. The list of rules was printed in simple, unassuming letters. 1. Do not look into mirrors for too long. 2. Ignore voices calling your name, unless you see the speaker. 3. Stay indoors past midnight. No exceptions. 4. If a soldier goes missing, do not search for them. They are already gone. I stared at the paper, half expecting some sort of explanation. None came. When I glanced up, the officer was already walking away, his boots crunching against the gravel. "What kind of place is this?" one of the other soldiers muttered. No one answered. I felt an unease settle in my chest as I folded the paper and stuffed it into my pocket. The cold was biting, but that wasn't why I shivered. We were being stationed at the edge of the world, and something about this place told me we weren't supposed to be here. That night, as I lay in my bunk, I heard my name. A whisper, soft as a breath, floating through the cracks in the wall. But when I turned my head, there was no one there. The wind howled through the abandoned streets of Pripyat, rattling broken window panes and sending dust swirling in ghostly spirals. The air smelled of damp concrete and decay. Even with my rifle strapped to my chest, I felt exposed, like something unseen was watching from the crumbling buildings. We had been ordered to retrieve classified materials from an underground bunker not far from the reactor. Our boots crunched against shattered glass and debris as we moved through the ruins, our breath fogging in the cold air. "Stick to the rules," Sergeant Volkov muttered under his breath. "No unnecessary risks." I glanced at the paper tucked into my chest pocket, the list of strange rules we were expected to follow. They made no sense, but after what I had already seen, I wasn't so quick to dismiss them. The bunker was beneath an old research facility. The entrance, a rusted metal hatch, groaned as we forced it open. A damp, metallic smell wafted up from below. My flashlight flickered against cold concrete walls as we descended the narrow stairs. The deeper we went, the heavier the air became, thick with the scent of old paper and something else, something foul like rotting meat. Private Sokolov, a young recruit barely out of training, whistled softly. "Creepy as hell down here." "Keep quiet," Volkov snapped. "We're not alone." A chill ran down my spine at his words. He didn't mean another person. The bunker was a maze of corridors and locked doors, many of them sealed with rusted chains. Our orders were clear: retrieve a set of documents stored in room 17. We moved in silence, our footsteps echoing in the empty halls. Then we found it. The door was slightly ajar, the number 17 barely visible under layers of dust. Inside, rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, their drawers left half open, as if someone had searched through them in a hurry. Sokolov stepped forward and reached for a broken mirror that lay face up on a desk. A jagged crack ran through its surface, splitting his reflection into uneven halves. "What do you think they were hiding down here?" he muttered, lifting the mirror to examine it. "Put that down," Volkov barked. "Don't look into it too long." Sokolov scoffed, but didn't lower the mirror. "Come on, you don't actually believe in—" The lights flickered. A deep hum vibrated through the walls. The temperature in the room dropped so fast that I could see my breath. Then, Sokolov gasped. His fingers tightened around the mirror. "What the hell?" I turned toward him and felt my stomach drop. His reflection in the broken glass was not moving in sync with him. It was slower, delayed by half a second. When he blinked, the reflection hesitated before following. And then, its lips curled into a grin that didn't belong to him. "Sokolov, put it down," I shouted. But it was too late. The lights went out completely, plunging us into darkness. The last thing I saw was his reflection reaching out toward him, before the mirror shattered on the floor. A scream rang out, raw and inhuman. When the lights flickered back to life, Sokolov was gone. His rifle lay on the floor. His footprints ended right where he had been standing. "No one searches for him," Volkov said firmly. "You all know the rule." A lump formed in my throat. I wanted to argue. I wanted to run down the corridors, calling his name. But I knew, deep down, I knew that whatever had taken Sokolov, it wasn't something we could fight. I glanced at the shattered mirror. The broken shards reflected all of us. All of us, except for me. The night was thick with silence, the kind that made your ears ring. The air smelled of damp concrete and something metallic, like rust or dry blood. My boots pressed into the dirt as I made my way through the crumbling remains of an old Soviet building, my flashlight cutting through the suffocating darkness. We had lost another man today. No screams, no struggle. One second he was there, the next gone. His bed was untouched, his boots still placed neatly beside it. The others refused to talk about it. Some stared at the walls, others buried themselves in vodka, but I couldn't ignore it. I needed answers. That was when I saw him. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, half hidden in the shadows. At first, I thought it was one of our missing men. But when he stepped forward, I knew I was wrong. He moved too smoothly, too deliberately, like someone who knew every crack in the floor before stepping on it. My grip tightened on my rifle. "Joao," he said, his voice coated in amusement, as if we were old friends. The way he said my name made my stomach churn. There was something wrong with it, like he was testing the weight of the word in his mouth. I lifted my flashlight, and the beam revealed his face. It was burned, melted in places, as if someone had poured acid over it. His left eye was missing, and yet he smiled. No, grinned, as if none of it hurt. That grin stretched too wide, showing teeth that were too perfect, too clean for a man who looked like he had been through hell. "You're James Cartwright," I said, though I already knew. His face was on one of the classified reports we found. A CIA operative sent into the zone before us. Officially, he had died years ago. But here he was, standing in front of me, looking anything but dead. James chuckled, tilting his head. "Ah, so you read my file. That means you've seen the lies, too." I didn't lower my rifle. "What lies?" His good eye flickered with something I couldn't place. "They told you the rules were to protect you, didn't they? To keep you safe from the radiation, from accidents." His grin widened. "But that's not what they're for." My throat tightened. "Then what are they for?" James stepped closer. The smell of burned flesh filled the air, mixing with something sickly sweet, like rotten fruit. My instinct screamed at me to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. "They're not keeping you safe," he whispered. "They're keeping it inside." A cold wave washed over me, crawling up my spine like icy fingers. James tapped the side of his temple. "Oh, you felt it already. The voices that call your name when no one's there. The shadows that stretch just a little too far. The way you see movement in your reflection when you're standing perfectly still." My heart pounded. I hadn't told anyone about the reflection, about how just last night I saw my own face in the mirror, but my mouth had been moving, whispering words I couldn't hear. James saw the fear in my eyes. He leaned in, voice barely above a breath. "You're starting to understand now, aren't you? This place isn't abandoned. It isn't empty. It's alive, and it wants you to break the rules." A sharp gust of wind howled through the broken windows, rattling the loose glass. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something standing behind me. But when I turned back, James was gone. No footsteps, no sound. Just the lingering scent of burnt skin. But something remained, scratched into the peeling wall beside me, words that hadn't been there before. Never trust the man who grins. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of Pripyat, rattling rusted metal and sending loose debris skittering across the cracked pavement. My breath formed small clouds in the frigid night air, but the chill in my bones had nothing to do with the cold. James stood in front of me, half his face hidden in shadow, the other half twisted in that unnatural grin. His melted skin stretched over his cheekbone, his teeth gleaming in the dim moonlight. He wasn't supposed to be alive, but here he was. "You're running out of time, soldier," he said, his voice a low rasp, like dead leaves scraping against concrete. "The choice is simple. Walk away and pretend none of this ever happened, or go through that door and see the truth for yourself." I followed his gaze to the building beside us. It was taller than the others, its windows shattered, its doorway yawning open like a black mouth. The concrete walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that made my skin crawl just looking at them. A single word had been scratched into the rusted metal of the entrance. "Stay out." Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back. The rules, the ones we were given on arrival, were clear. Never enter a building after midnight. Yet here I was, standing at the threshold of something ancient, something that had been waiting. "What's inside?" I asked. My voice sounded hollow. James chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "Something older than the city, older than the men who built it. You already know the truth, don't you? Chernobyl wasn't just an accident. It was a cage, and now you're about to open it." My hands clenched into fists. "If that's true, why are you still here?" The grin widened. "Because I made the same mistake you're about to make." A deep sense of dread settled in my chest. The others, my unit, were gone, either missing or changed. I had seen their faces in the dark, heard their voices where they shouldn't be. And the worst part, I could feel something watching me, waiting. I took a step forward. "Ah," James sighed, shaking his head. "Curiosity, the deadliest of human traits." I ignored him and stepped inside. The air changed the moment I crossed the threshold. It was thick, heavy, like walking through unseen water. The walls pulsed as though breathing. The floor beneath my boots felt soft, like flesh. My flashlight flickered, the beam of light struggling to cut through the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a whisper. It was my own voice. "Joao." My heart pounded against my ribs. The hallway stretched unnaturally long, the shadows shifting with every step I took. The deeper I went, the more wrong everything felt. The walls began to melt like candle wax, faces forming and dissolving within them. They were screaming, but there was no sound. The whispers grew louder. "Joao, you shouldn't have come." I turned a corner and froze. There was a mirror at the end of the hallway. Large, old, covered in dust. My reflection stood inside it, but it wasn't me. It smiled. Not just any smile. James's grin. I took a step back. My reflection did not. Then it moved toward me. The thing in the mirror tilted its head. Its eyes were empty, black voids where my own should have been. My skin prickled with cold terror as it raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. A hairline crack spread across the surface. Another whisper, right behind my ear. "Now you belong to it." I turned, but there was nothing there. The crack in the mirror grew wider. Then the lights went out. I stood in front of the door, my hand hovering over the cold metal of the handle. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows of the abandoned building, but it felt strangely distant, as if the wind itself had become a foreign thing. Everything had begun to blur. The lines between reality and the other side had started to fade, and I could feel myself slipping, like I was losing hold of something important, something that would keep me grounded. I had broken the final rule. The thought ran through my head again and again, like a broken record. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but there was no turning back now. I had already crossed the threshold. Stepping through the door felt like stepping into something I couldn't explain. The moment my foot hit the cold floor inside, a ripple passed through the air, a sharp shiver that crawled up my spine. The room felt wrong. The shadows seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally, reaching toward me like hands trying to pull me deeper into the darkness. I couldn't look away from them, even though the rules told me not to. I had to know what they were, what they meant. The rules had always been so clear. Never look into mirrors for too long. Never respond to voices you can't see. Never go outside after midnight. But now those rules seemed like distant echoes, irrelevant in the face of what I was about to learn. The room around me was a desolate shell. Furniture that once looked comfortable was now just crumbling wood and torn fabric. A dusty mirror hung crookedly on the wall, reflecting nothing but the dim, sickly light of my flashlight. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed a mirror, the one I wasn't supposed to look at. But there was something about it that was pulling me in. I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I moved toward it, my feet heavy, my heart pounding harder with every step. The reflection staring back at me was wrong. I saw myself, but not quite. The man in the mirror wasn't me. Not entirely. His eyes were too hollow, his expression too cold. There was a grin, wide and unsettling, stretched across his face, but it wasn't mine. It was something else entirely, something ancient. I tried to pull away, but my legs wouldn't move. The smile in the mirror twisted, becoming more grotesque, more unnatural. It felt alive, mocking me, daring me to look deeper. Then, the voice came, soft, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. You shouldn't have come here. I spun around, my pulse racing. There was no one behind me. I was alone. But the voice, it came from inside my head, echoing like a shadow. I backed away from the mirror, my breath quickening. I had broken the final rule. No one was supposed to step inside after midnight, especially not alone. But I did, and now I was paying the price. The floor beneath me groaned. The walls seemed to pulse, like the entire building was alive. The air turned thick, suffocating, as if something was pressing down on me. I could feel it. It was waiting, watching. Something shifted in the corner of my eye. I turned and saw a figure standing at the far end of the room. For a moment, I thought it was another soldier, maybe one who had disappeared days ago. But when I blinked, the figure was closer, standing just a few feet away, its features hidden by the darkness. I stepped back, but my legs felt like lead. My voice was frozen in my throat as the figure took another step forward, its face hidden behind a veil of shadows. I could feel it now, the presence, cold and suffocating, drawing closer. You've made your choice, the figure spoke. The voice was low, gravelly, but not quite human. It was James, or at least, it looked like him. His face was melted, distorted, and his grin, it was stretched impossibly wide, like something not meant for this world. But it was him, James Cartwright, the one who had warned me, the one who had given me that choice. And now, standing in front of me, he was no longer human. He was a thing, twisted and broken, yet still smiling. You didn't listen, he rasped, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Now you belong to it. The ground trembled beneath me, as if the building itself were shaking, as if the very walls were closing in. I tried to move, to run, but the air grew heavy, thick with an oppressive weight. The rules were no longer just things to follow. They were the chains that kept me from escaping. I had broken them, and now there was no turning back. The space around me seemed to fold, twisting and contorting into shapes that made no sense. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched like tendrils, and I felt myself being pulled toward them, drawn into the same darkness that had consumed James. The grin on his face widened, impossibly so, until it was a gaping maw of darkness. There is no escape, soldier. You've crossed the threshold. I closed my eyes, unable to bear the sight any longer. But even with my eyes shut, I could still see it, feel it crawling over me. I could hear the whispers like 1,000 voices murmuring just out of reach, and I knew this was it. I was part of it now. The anomaly, the thing that had been trapped in this place, had finally claimed me. And in that final moment, I understood. The rules were never just to keep us safe. They were to keep us contained, to prevent us from seeing the truth, from knowing the horror that lurked just beyond our comprehension. But I had seen it. I had broken it. I was no longer Joel Mikhailov, the soldier. I was part of something else now, something ancient, something that could never be undone. And as the world around me dissolved into darkness, I heard that voice again, clearer than before. Welcome home. It was the last thing I would ever hear. I was already halfway through the report when the words stopped making sense. It was as if the paper itself had shifted, the ink blurring and pooling in strange patterns I couldn't understand. I blinked and looked at the document again, but it hadn't changed. It was my mind playing tricks, wasn't it? I had been chasing the same shadows for years. Years of looking through classified files, try to piece together the mystery that haunted my every step. The man who was never truly gone. The soldier who had disappeared in the exclusion zone and left nothing behind but an unsettling silence and an impossible truth. His name was Joao Mikhailov, a Soviet soldier, part of the ill-fated mission to retrieve those classified materials from Chernobyl. A man who, according to the records, was swallowed by the zone, his body lost to the cracks of time and radiation. But it was the shadow that stayed behind. The first line of the report caught my attention. The disappearance of Sergeant Joao Mikhailov was marked as a classified incident. The official report states he perished due to radiation exposure during the Chernobyl disaster, but the true nature of his disappearance remains unknown. I didn't need to read further to know where it was going. It was always the same story, always shrouded in secrecy, and yet something in my gut twisted as I read the next part. Despite the disappearance, an anomaly was discovered within the exclusion zone in the weeks following the incident. The anomaly was traced back to the very site where Mikhailov's unit had last been stationed. A peculiar presence was reported. An unsettling, grinning shadow was seen flickering along the walls, often near the location where Mikhailov had been last seen alive. The report continued to describe other soldiers who were involved in that ill-fated mission. The same unsettling trend, disappearances. Soldiers vanishing, their faces returning to camp blank, empty, their movements stiff. But it was Mikhailov who had changed everything. A soldier named Andrei Chernov was sent to investigate the anomaly. He returned with disturbing reports. Chernov claimed to have seen Mikhailov's reflection in the broken glass of a mirror, but it was not him. He was different. The reflection grinned at him, not in the way Mikhailov ever had. And there was again the grin. It was a pattern, one that I had seen too many times now in the reports. Soldiers, shadows, grinning faces. Something was wrong with the exclusion zone. Something wrong with the very rules they had been given. The rules had been meant to protect them, but all they did was delay the inevitable. And now, years later, I could see it clearly in these declassified pages. The rules weren't for safety. They were to keep them from knowing the truth, from realizing that something else was there. Something trapped. Something waiting. The final entry in the report was chilling. It is believed that Mikhailov's presence still lingers within the zone. His shadow, still faintly visible in certain abandoned buildings, moves as though is alive. The last report suggests that the shadow flickers and writhes, attempting to break free from the boundaries it has been bound to, seeking escape through any available host. I stared at those last words, the final warning. It wasn't just the soldiers anymore, not just those who had broken the rules, but anyone who entered the zone. The shadow of Joao Mikhailov wasn't done. It wasn't done with Chernobyl, and it wasn't done with me. The last line lingered in my mind, almost echoing, "Never trust a man who grins." I shut the folder with a snap, the words still hanging in the air around me like a ghost I couldn't quite shake. The files were buried for a reason, locked away by powers that no one could touch. But the truth was undeniable. Joao Mikhailov hadn't disappeared. Not really. Not in the way they thought. I had read the files. I had studied the patterns. And now, I was part of the story. The rules that they had followed, the whispers that they had ignored, the grins they had seen. Those were no longer distant echoes of the past. They were a warning. And somehow, I knew that the shadow of Chernobyl had finally found me.